Use a warm. Empathetic Tony Ma Thompson stood in the crew lounge at Heathrow Airport, staring at her reflection in the small mirror. At 26, she had everything she thought she wanted. She worked as a flight attendant for British Airways, wore the crisp uniform she had dreamed of since childhood, and travelled to different cities every week. But lately, her dream job felt more like a prison. 3 months had passed since the incident that changed everything. Emma could still remember every detail of that terrible day. She was working a routine flight from London to Manchester when suddenly her world turned upside down. Right there in the narrow aisle, surrounded by passengers who depended on her, Emma felt her chest tighten and her hands begin to shake. Her breathing became quick and shallow. The cabin seemed to spin round her. For one terrifying moment, she thought she might collapse right there in front of everyone. A passenger had to help her to a seat, while another flight attendant took over her duties. Emma had never felt so embarrassed and scared in her entire life. Since that day, every flight felt like climbing a steep mountain. Emma would stand in the small galley area, gripping the metal counter with white knuckles, fighting against the voice in her head that whispered cruel things. "You don't belong here," the voice would say. "You're too weak. You're going to have another panic attack. Everyone will see how pathetic you are." Emma had thought about quitting her job dozens of times. She would lie awake at night, wondering if she should find a different career, something safe on the ground where she couldn't embarrass herself in front of hundreds of people. On this particular Tuesday morning, Emma was preparing for another flight when she noticed something unusual. Captain James Mitchell, who she had worked with many times over the past 2 years, was walking differently. He seemed to be limping slightly as he made his way toward the cockpit. Emma had always respected Captain Mitchell. He was a kind man in his 50s with gentle grey eyes and a calm voice that made passengers feel safe. She had never seen him show any sign of physical difficulty before. Throughout the flight, Emma found herself watching him more carefully, wondering if he was hurt or sick. When they landed in Edinburgh, Emma gathered all her courage and decided to ask him about it. Her heart was beating fast as she approached him, but she was genuinely concerned about his well-being. "Captain Mitchell," she said quietly, looking round to make sure no other crew members were listening, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you all right? I noticed you seemed to be having some trouble walking today." Captain Mitchell looked at her for a long moment, then smiled in his gentle way. "Emma, walk with me for a moment," he said. They stepped away from the busy gate area and found a quiet corner of the airport. Captain Mitchell looked round carefully to make sure no one was close enough to hear their conversation. Then he did something that completely shocked Emma. He rolled up his left trouser leg. Emma gasped softly and covered her mouth with her hand, where she expected to see a normal leg. There was a sophisticated prosthetic limb made of metal and plastic. It looked expensive and well-made, but it was clearly artificial. "I lost my leg in Afghanistan 15 years ago," Captain Mitchell said in his calm, steady voice. "I was serving in the military when an explosion injured me badly. The doctors had to remove my leg below the knee." Emma stared at him, unable to speak. She had flown with this man dozens of times and had never suspected anything. "I've been flying commercial flights ever since I recovered," he continued. "Every single morning, I wake up and put on this prosthetic leg. Some days it hurts. Some days it's uncomfortable. But every day, I choose to fly, not because it's easy, but because I know that every person who steps onto my plane trusts me to get them home safely." I felt tears forming in her eyes. "But how do you do it?" she whispered. "How do you stay so calm and confident when you're dealing with something so difficult?" Captain Mitchell placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Emma, I've heard about your struggles lately. The other crew members care about you very much. And they've mentioned that you've been having a hard time since your panic attack 3 months ago." Emma nodded, feeling ashamed. She had hoped that her problems weren't obvious to everyone. But apparently they were. "Let me tell you something important," Captain Mitchell continued. "The strongest pilots and flight attendants are not the ones who never feel fear or never face challenges. They're the ones who feel the fear and choose to fly anyway. They're the ones who have learned to navigate their own personal storms before they can help others through difficult times." Emma looked up at him, and for the first time in months, she felt a small spark of hope in her chest. "You see, Emma, aviation is full of secrets. But they're not the kind of secrets you might think. They're not about covering up mistakes or hiding dangerous information. They're secrets about courage, about ordinary people who carry on despite their fears, about the incredible things people do every day to keep others safe." As they walked back toward their gate, Emma felt something shift inside her heart. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. Maybe her struggles and her panic attacks didn't automatically disqualify her from her dreams of working in aviation. "Captain Mitchell," she said, finding her voice again, "would you tell me more about these secrets?" He smiled at her, and his eyes were full of kindness and understanding. "Emma, I think you're ready to discover them for yourself." The next week, Emma began her work shifts with completely different eyes. Captain Mitchell's words kept playing in her mind like a song she couldn't forget. "Aviation is full of secrets about courage," he had said. Now Emma started noticing things she had never seen before, small details that revealed the true heart of the people she worked with. On a Thursday morning, Emma was working a flight from London to Dublin. The sky was grey and cloudy, and the cabin felt quiet and peaceful. Emma was serving drinks to passengers when she heard soft crying from the middle of the plane. She looked over and saw an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes talking to the passenger sitting next to her. The woman's name was Mrs. Davies, and she was explaining through her tears that she was flying to Ireland for her grandson's funeral. The young man had died in a car accident, and Mrs. Davies was the only family member who could afford to make the trip. But in her grief and rush to pack, she had forgotten to bring money for food during her journey. Emma watched as Captain Robert Hughes, who was travelling as a passenger back to Dublin, quietly got up from his seat. She saw him approach Mrs. Davies with gentle steps, speaking to her in hushed, caring tones. Emma couldn't hear what he was saying, but she saw him slip something into the woman's hand before patting her shoulder softly. Later, when Emma had a chance to talk to Captain Hughes, she learned what had happened. He had given Mrs. Davies £50 from his own wallet, enough money to buy meals during her trip, and maybe even a small gift for the funeral. "She reminded me of my own mother," Captain Hughes told Emma, his voice full of emotion. "I couldn't bear to see her suffer like that, you know. Emma, we're not just here to fly planes from one place to another. We're here to take care of people, to help them through their difficult moments." The following Tuesday, Emma was working another flight when she witnessed something else that touched her heart deeply. A young mother named Lisa was sitting near the front of the plane with her baby. The infant was crying loudly, and Lisa looked exhausted and worried. She kept checking her bag, looking more and more upset. Emma approached her to offer help. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently. Lisa looked up with tears in her eyes. "My baby needs formula, but I forgot to pack enough. I don't know what to do. The flight is still 2 hours long, and he's so hungry." Emma watched as her colleague, flight attendant Mary Wilson, overheard the conversation. Mary quickly disappeared into the galley area and returned a few minutes later with a tin of baby formula, still in its original packaging. "Where did you get that?" Emma asked Mary quietly. Mary smiled warmly. "I bought it with my own money at the airport shop before we took off. I saw the mother struggling during boarding and thought she might need it. I always keep emergency supplies for situations like this." Emma was amazed. "But that must have cost you quite a bit of money." £20, Mary said simply, watching as the baby began to drink peacefully. "But look at that little one now. He's happy and comfortable. That's worth much more than £20 to me." As the weeks passed, Emma discovered more and more hidden acts of kindness happening all round her. She learned that ground crew member Tom Jenkins often worked through his lunch breaks to help elderly passengers with their heavy luggage. He would carry bags and push wheelchairs, never asking for extra pay or recognition. She found out that pilot Susan Clark had once flown an extra 200 miles off the planned route to get a passing to the hospital where his wife was having emergency surgery. The man had received a phone call during the flight saying his wife might not survive, and Captain Clark made the decision to help him get there faster. "I didn't tell anyone about it," Susan explained when Emma asked her about the story. "It cost me my perfect fuel efficiency bonus that year, but that man needed to be with his wife." Some things are more important than bonuses or perfect records. Emma met baggage handler Michael Brown, who told her about the time he worked 18 hours straight during a terrible snowstorm. He was determined to make sure Christmas presents made it to their destinations on time. Even though he was exhausted and cold, children all over the country were waiting for those packages. Michael said, his eyes shining with pride, "I thought about my own kids at home and knew I couldn't let those families down. Christmas only comes once a year." Each story touched Emma's heart deeply. She began to understand that aviation wasn't just about moving people from place to place. Like packages, it was about carrying their hopes, dreams, and deepest needs. Every passenger had a story, and every crew member was part of helping write happy endings. One evening, as Emma was finishing her shift, she found herself in the crew lounge with several colleagues. The conversation naturally turned to why they had chosen to work in aviation. "I love being part of something bigger than myself," said flight attendant Helen Wright. "Every day, I help people reach their loved ones, attend important meetings, start new chapters in their lives. It's truly an honor." Pilot David Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "I carry photos of my passengers in my mind. Not real photos, but I think about them. The businessman going to his daughter's wedding, the student flying home for the holidays, the elderly couple taking their dream vacation. Each person matters." Emma felt tears forming in her eyes. "I never realized how much love goes into this job." "That's the secret, Emma," said Captain Mitchell, who had just joined their conversation. "The aviation industry is built on love. Love for safety, love for service, love for the people we'll never know personally, but will always protect." Christmas week arrived with the worst weather Emma had ever seen in her life. Heavy snow covered London like a thick white blanket, and fierce winds howled through the city, making flying conditions extremely dangerous. The airport looked like a disaster zone, with hundreds of flights delayed or cancelled completely. Emma walked through the terminal and saw families camping on the floor with their luggage scattered around. And them, children were crying from exhaustion and confusion. Elderly passengers sat in uncomfortable chairs, looking lost and worried about whether they would make it home for Christmas. The weight of responsibility felt heavier on Emma's shoulders than it had ever felt before. In the crew briefing room, Emma witnessed something she had never seen before. Captain Alice Thompson, who was usually calm and composed like a rock, was sitting alone with her head buried in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking slightly, and Emma could tell something was very wrong. "Captain Thompson." Emma approached her carefully, speaking in a soft voice. "Are you all right?" Alice looked up. and Emma was shocked to see that her eyes were red with tears. Alice had always seemed so strong and unbreakable, but now she looked completely heartbroken. "Emma, I've been flying for 22 years," Alice said, her voice trembling. "In all that time, I've never cancelled a flight unless it was absolutely necessary for safety. But today, I had to make the terrible decision to cancel 6 flights, 6 planes full of people who were counting on me to get them home for Christmas." Emma sat down in the chair beside her. "But you made that decision to keep them safe." "Right. That was the right thing to do." "Yes," Alice nodded slowly. "But that doesn't make it any easier to live with. Do you know what it feels like to look directly into the eyes of a mother who's desperately trying to get home to her children on Christmas Eve? To see the complete disappointment on the face of a soldier who's been deployed overseas for 8 months and just wants to surprise his family." Emma had never thought about this difficult side of aviation before. She had always been focused on her own fears and personal challenges. But now she was seeing the enormous emotional weight that pilots and crew members carried on their shoulders every single day. Later that day, Emma walked through the maintenance hangar and met Charlie Wilson, a young aircraft mechanic who looked completely exhausted. His clothes were dirty with grease. His hair was messy, and his eyes were red from lack of sleep. She learned that he had been working for 36 hours straight, checking and rechecking every single plane that was scheduled to fly once the weather cleared. "Charlie, you look like you haven't slept in days," Emma said, genuinely concerned about his well-being. Charlie rubbed his tired eyes with the back of his hand. "I can't sleep, Emma. Every bolt I tighten, every wire I check, every system I test, I know that hundreds of people's lives depend on my work being absolutely perfect. If I make even one small mistake, people could die." He paused and looked at the large aircraft in front of him. "My father died in a plane crash when I was 12 years old. It was caused by a maintenance error, not by anyone at our company. But still, I became a mechanic because I promised myself that no child would ever lose their parent because of something I could have prevented." Emma felt her heart break for Charlie. The pain in his voice was obvious, and she could see how much pressure he put on himself. "That's an enormous burden to carry every single day." "It is," Charlie admitted honestly. "But it's also what makes me better at my job every day. I work as if my own family were going to be passengers on these planes, because, in a way, we are all family up here in the sky." Air traffic controller Sarah Phillips shared her own story with Emma during a break. "Last month, I guided a plane through an emergency landing when their landing gear malfunctioned. For 45 long minutes, I held the lives of 237 people in my hands. I had to stay calm and give perfect instructions while knowing that one wrong word could cause a disaster." When they finally landed safely, "I went to the bathroom and cried for 20 minutes. Emma began to understand that everyone in aviation carried invisible weights that other people couldn't see. The pilots who made split-second decisions that affected hundreds of lives. The flight attendants who smiled and stayed calm even when they were terrified inside. The ground crews who worked in terrible weather conditions. The air traffic controllers who guided planes through dangerous situations while fighting their own fears." On Christmas Eve, Emma was working her final flight of the week when she met 8-year-old Tommy Green, who was flying alone to visit his grandmother. Tommy was scared and had been crying quietly in his seat. His small face was red, and he kept looking round nervously. Emma knelt down beside his seat to be at his eye level. "Tommy, are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help you feel better?" "I'm scared of flying," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. "What if something bad happens to our plane?" Emma looked into his innocent, frightened eyes and felt the full weight of her responsibility. This child was trusting her with his life, his safety, and his Christmas happiness at that moment. Emma realized that carrying the trust of others wasn't just a job, it was a sacred responsibility that required her to be stronger than her fears. 6 months had passed since Emma's first conversation with Captain Mitchell, and she was about to face the biggest test of her life. It was a routine Tuesday flight from London to Glasgow with 143 passengers aboard. Emma was working alongside flight attendant Peter Walsh, a friendly colleague who had always been supportive of her. They were flying under the command of Captain Jennifer Adams, a skilled pilot with many years of experience. The flight started like any other normal day. Passengers boarded the plane, found their seats, and settled in for the journey. Emma served drinks and snacks, chatted with travelers, and helped parents with their children. Everything seemed perfectly normal and peaceful. But 30 minutes before they were supposed to land, everything changed. Captain Adams' voice came over the intercom, speaking in a calm but serious tone that immediately caught everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical issue with our landing gear. As a precaution, we're going to circle the airport while our ground crew prepares for our arrival. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of your cabin crew." Emma's heart began to race like a wild horse. This was exactly the kind of situation that had triggered her panic attacks before. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her breathing became shallow and quick. Her hands started trembling, and she could feel sweat forming on her forehead. For a moment, Emma felt like she was back to that terrible day 3 months ago when she had her first panic attack. The voice in her head started whispering the same cruel words. "You can't handle this. You're going to embarrass yourself. Everyone will see how weak you are." But then something amazing happened. Emma remembered Captain Mitchell's wise words, "The strongest flight attendants are those who feel the fear and choose to fly anyway." She thought about Charlie Wilson, the mechanic who worked tirelessly to keep planes safe because he had lost his father in a crash. She remembered Alice Thompson, the pilot, who carried the weight of every passenger's trust on her shoulders. She thought about all the silent guardians who had shared their stories with her over the past months. Emma took a deep breath and looked round the cabin. She saw fear in the passengers' eyes, the same fear she was feeling in her own heart. But she also saw something else that gave her strength. They were looking to her for reassurance, for strength, for hope. These people were counting on her to help them through this frightening moment. "Peter," she whispered to her colleague, speaking quietly so passengers couldn't hear, "I need you to help me stay calm. I've been struggling with anxiety, but these people need us to be strong for them." Peter nodded with understanding and gave her an encouraging smile. "Emma, you're stronger than you know. I've watched you grow and change over these past months. You've got this. I believe in you." As the plane continued to circle the airport, Emma made a decision that would change her life forever. Instead of hiding in the galley and fighting her panic, she walked through the cabin, speaking to passengers one by one. She knelt beside Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman with grey hair who was travelling to see her new great-grandson. "I'm scared, dear," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her voice shaking. Emma took the woman's wrinkled hand in hers and spoke in a gentle, confident voice. "Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that Captain Adams is one of the finest pilots I've ever worked with. She's landed planes in much worse conditions than this, and our ground crew there preparing everything perfectly for our arrival. You're going to meet that great-grandson of yours today, and it's going to be wonderful." She moved to the next row and spoke to Mr. Kumar, a businessman who was gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles were white. "Sir, I know this is frightening, But I want you to know that I've learned something amazing about aviation. Every single person involved in getting this plane safely on the ground, from the pilots to the air traffic controllers to the emergency crews, they're all thinking about you right now. They are all working together to get you home safely. Emma moved through the cabin like an angel of comfort. Her own fear was still there, but it was transforming into something much more powerful: purpose. She helped calm crying children by telling them stories and making funny faces. She reassured worried parents by explaining how safe flying really was. She held the hands of anxious passengers and looked directly into their eyes while speaking words of comfort and hope. With each person she comforted, Emma felt stronger and more confident. She realized that her panic attacks and her struggles with anxiety hadn't been weaknesses after all. They had been preparing her for this exact moment. They had taught her to recognize fear in others and to know exactly what people needed to hear when they were scared. The plane continued circling, but Emma no longer felt afraid. She felt like she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. 1 year had passed since the emergency landing that changed Emma's life forever. She now stood in the crew lounge at Heathrow Airport, staring at her laptop screen with a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had just published her 50th blog post on her website, which she had named Flight Secrets: The Untold Stories of Aviation Heroes. What had started as a simple personal journal had grown into something much bigger and more meaningful than Emma had ever imagined. She had begun sharing the stories of all the silent guardians she had met during her journey there. Pilots who carried passengers' hopes and dreams, the mechanics who worked with the heavy weight of responsibility, and the flight attendants who had learned to turn their personal struggles into strength. Captain Mitchell approached her quietly, reading over her shoulder with great interest. "Emma, I just finished reading your latest post about Charlie Wilson. His story about becoming a mechanic after his father's tragic accident brought tears to my eyes. You have a gift for telling these important stories." Emma smiled warmly and looked up at her mentor, Captain Mitchell. "Do you remember what you told me that day in Edinburgh? You said aviation was full of secrets about courage. I finally understand what you meant by those words. Tell me what you've learned." "Captain," Mitchell said, settling into a comfortable chair beside her. Emma closed her laptop and turned to face him completely. "The greatest secret in aviation isn't about hidden dangers or government cover-ups like people might think. It's about love, every single day. Thousands of people in this industry wake up and choose to carry the enormous responsibility of strangers' lives on their shoulders. They do it not because they have to, but because they genuinely care about getting people home safely to their families." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts and emotions. "I've learned so many beautiful things about the people we work with. Captain Hughes gives his own money to passengers in need because he sees his mother in every elderly traveler who struggles. Mary Wilson keeps emergency supplies for babies in her bag because she remembers being a struggling young mother herself. Many years ago, Charlie Wilson checks every bolt and wire twice because he knows the terrible pain of losing a parent in an accident. Alice Thompson cries when she has to cancel flights because she understands that she's not just canceling transportation, she's affecting Christmas mornings, family reunions, and final goodbyes." Captain Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "And what about you, Emma? What's your secret? What have you discovered about yourself?" Emma smiled, feeling tears of gratitude forming in her eyes. "My secret is that my anxiety attacks weren't my weakness like I thought they were. They were actually my preparation for something greater. They taught me to recognize fear in other people, to understand their deep need for reassurance, and to know exactly what someone needs to hear when they're scared and feeling alone. My broken places became my strongest places. She opened her laptop again and showed him her most recent blog post. I wrote about something I call the aviation family. It's about how we're all connected in ways we don't always realize. Pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, ground crews, air traffic controllers, and even passengers. We're all part of this invisible family that takes care of each other every single day. Captain Mitchell read quietly from her post. Every time you step onto an airplane, you're surrounded by people who have chosen to make your safety their #1 priority. The pilot who does extra safety checks because they're thinking about their own family at home. The flight attendant who smiles even when they're having the worst day of their life. The mechanic who stays late to make sure every system is working perfectly. The ground crew member who works in the rain to get your luggage to you safely. These are the real flight secrets, not scandals or cover-ups, but love stories. Love stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things for strangers they'll never know personally, but will always protect. Emma, Captain Mitchell said, with obvious pride in his voice, you've discovered the most important secret of all. You've learned that aviation isn't just about moving people from place to place like cargo. It's about carrying their hopes, dreams, fears, and trust. It's about being part of something much bigger than ourselves. Emma nodded with deep understanding. And I've learned that everyone has a story worth telling. Everyone has struggles they're fighting, and everyone has the potential to turn their pain into purpose. The businessman who seems rude might be flying to his mother's funeral, the crying. Charles might be flying to see their parent who's been deployed overseas for months. The anxious passenger might be facing their fears just like I was facing mine 3 months later. Emma found herself standing in front of a group of 20 new flight attendants, giving them their very first orientation training. She looked into their young, eager faces and remembered her own first day full of dreams, hopes, and fears about the future. Welcome to aviation, she began with confidence and warmth. You're about to become part of something truly special and meaningful. You're going to learn that this job isn't just about serving drinks and demonstrating safety procedures. You're going to become guardians of people's hopes and dreams. Protectors of their most precious moments. The end.